I'm here on the floor today to talk about the legislation that's before the Senate, which is a great opportunity to help our national parks. The bill does a number of things, as people have heard about, to help with regard to our public lands, with regard to fishing access, with regard to community parks. But one thing it does that is absolutely essential is it includes the Restore Our Parks Act. And that is legislation that is necessary right now to fix our national parks. Now, I say fix our national parks, you know, they're a treasure. When people are asked about the national parks, usually they use that word. It's a treasure. It's a great asset of the United States. Ken Burns, I think, said it's America's best idea. And he did a great documentary on the parks, by the way. But the point is, our national parks are spectacular. They're majestic. They tell the history of our country. There's so many good things about them. But the problem is that our parks right now are under a huge backlog of maintenance projects, $12.5 billion. Now, that's way more than the parks budget, and they just can't get out from under it. It's been happening for years and years and years. So think about people going back to our parks this summer after the coronavirus hopefully gets better and people are able to go to these reopened parks. We'll probably have huge attendance, but when they get there, they're going to find out that the trail is closed because of erosion, or the bathroom doesn't work because the bathroom has deteriorated, or they can't go to the visitor center because the ceiling has been leaking, which has caused mold on the walls, which has caused the floors to couple. The highways and the bridges are crumbling. And this is what's happening in our national parks. We have asked them as members of Congress to give us a full list over the last few years of this because we keep hearing about this, and they have. They have about $6.5 billion of high priority projects and then about $6 billion of priority projects, and the list continues to grow. And by the way, the costs continue to compound. In other words, they get worse and worse every year. Just like, think about your own home. If you don't fix the roof, the leaking roof I talked about, you have all these other problems. If you can get at it and fix it when it happens, you have much lower costs. So for taxpayers, all of us as taxpayers, we should want to fix this maintenance backlog and be able, once again, to say not only are these parks a treasure, but these parks are open and everything's open, and we can do a better job in stewardship. This legislation does that. Not a penny of the funding, by the way, can go toward expansion of the parks, because I've heard that from some of my colleagues. Well, you all keep putting money into expanding the parks. No, that's not what this is about. This is about stewardship. This is about ensuring that we take better care of what we have. I can't think of a more fiscally conservative idea than that. I think it's important for us to realize that this legislation before us is not about expanding anything. It's about taking better care of what we have. The annual appropriations from Congress to the parks funds the rangers. It funds the nature programs. It funds the basics to continue to operate the parks. What it does not fund are these maintenance backlog problems, these big projects. We've been ignoring them for decades, by the way. This is not new, but it's built up, and it's getting worse and worse as the costs compound. Let me give you an example. Cuyahoga Valley National Park is in Ohio. We love Cuyahoga Valley. It's the 13th most visited national park in the country. You may not have heard of it, but if you're ever in the Akron-Cleveland area, I hope you'll go. It's spectacular. But guess what? They have a maintenance backlog of just over $50 million. Their annual budget from the Park Service is $11 million. And that covers everything. That operates the entire park, the 13th most visited park in America. It's a beautiful park, basically from Cleveland to Akron. Beautiful along the Cuyahoga River, beautiful because it has a tourism train that goes through it, a single track or a narrow gauge train, and it's just a great place. But guess what? The train tracks are falling apart, and that's a huge expense, and that can't come out of this annual budget because you have to replace the ties and so on. There's a bridge that I saw that's crumbling that's not going to be able to be used soon for bicyclists or hikers to go over the river because it's falling apart. That bridge is a capital expense. It takes a lot of funding to do that and to do it right. So the legislation before us says, let's take this on. Let's get started on getting this backlog behind us so that we can focus on having the most majestic and the most beautiful parks in the world here that we can continue to be proud of. The way we do it is really interesting. We say, okay, we're going to continue to have the annual appropriations, and we're going to properly fund the parks that way. But for these backlog problems, we're going to take funding from offshore and onshore oil and gas and other energy projects that are currently going directly into the government, and we're going to take no more than half of that funding that's unobligated, in other words, not obligated to any other purpose, and we're going to say, let's use that funding up to a cap every year to reduce about half of the backlog over the next 5 years. It's the priority projects I talked about, the $6.5 billion. To me, this makes all the sense in the world. And again, it's going to save us money over time, assuming we want our parks to be working. We want the trails to be open. We want the visitor centers to be open, which of course we do and we must. Our parks are more visited than others, than ever. And it's important that we have parks that are ready, particularly when people start to go back to the parks this summer. Some of my colleagues have come to the floor and said, well, isn't there another way to do this? I mean, I wish there were, but this is a pretty good funding source. And for those who say it's not paid for, well, I'm telling you what the funding source is. It is the royalties that come off of these energy projects. And by the way, this is for a good conservation cause and a good, again, fiscally conservative cause to get these long-term maintenance problems under control so that they don't continue to grow and grow and grow. I first started on this project over 13 years ago, which is why this is kind of exciting for me that it's finally coming, I hope, to fruition here in the Senate at least. I was the O&B director for President George W. Bush, the Office of Management and Budget. And in our budget in 2007, we put in place a centennial project for the parks. The park celebrated its 100th year anniversary in 2016, and building up to that, we wanted to deal with this long-term maintenance backlog and provide some more funding for the parks. I worked with the Secretary of the Interior at the time. This is, again, the George W. Bush administration, Republican administration. I worked with Democrats here on the Hill. We worked with all the outside groups concerned about the parks and came up with a creative way to get public-private partnership money in and to provide more funding for this long-term maintenance problem. We were not successful in getting Congress to take it up and to appropriate those funds at the time. But I continued working on this a couple years later when I was asked to serve on the Centennial Commission on the parks. I was not in office at that time. I had left politics, thinking forever, but now I'm back here in the Senate. But on the Centennial Commission, again, we analyzed what was going on in the parks in connection with the centennial coming up in 2016. And what was the number one issue? Of course, it was this long-term maintenance backlog and how you deal with it, and the great frustration that people felt that we just couldn't get on top of it. So I've been at this for some time. I see that some of my colleagues are saying there must be other ways, to fund this, and some have suggested, well, let's raise some fees. Well, I am the author of the Centennial Act, which was passed about 3 years ago, on the last day, practically, of session in 2016, and that legislation actually takes the senior fee, which is the lifetime senior pass, and increased it, actually quadrupled it, to provide more funding for this very purpose and other purposes at the parks. That was not without controversy. I can show you some of the letters and emails that I got and some of the phone calls that we received with regard to increasing the senior pass. But we did it for the right reasons, because we thought the senior pass was a relatively good deal, which it still is, by the way. It's a tremendous deal for our seniors. But we decided we were going to take some heat on this in order to provide more revenue for the parks, because we were so frustrated couldn't find other sources. I'm also the author of the Centennial Challenge as part of that legislation, which allows for the private sector to provide funding to our parks. Again, we did this because we were very interested in finding more funding. And the Centennial Challenge Fund is a public-private partnership. It requires that every federal dollar that goes into the parks be matched at least 1-to-1 with a private sector dollar. And I've been involved with that. I've been involved in selling that program and encouraging the private sector to do more. Since we passed that in 2008, fiscal year 2008, Congress has provided $129 million in appropriations, which has been leveraged by an additional $67 million in non-federal funding. In other words, it's been more than 1-to-1. There's been more than $1 of private sector funding that has matched the $1 of federal funding. So that has worked. But folks, it has its limits. We're talking about $12.5 billion in the backlog, and the numbers I just gave you were we were able to raise $167 million in non-federal funding. So, you know, I would just say to my colleagues who say that, gosh, why can't you raise fees and so on, that's been done. I will say also with regard to fees into some of our parks, it's not very practical. The Cuyahoga Valley National Park is an example. There are literally dozens of entrances to the park. I mean, the park is in a suburban area through Akron and Cleveland, that area. And you can get to the park through all sorts of different roads and avenues, and there's no grand entrance to the park. There is a great visitor center, which people are encouraged to go to as they enter the park. But there are bike trails through it. There's a railroad through it, as I talked about, and there are lots of roads that come into it. So it's not like you're driving into a Yellowstone Park and you got to go through a designated entrance. So is there more we can do in some of these areas to provide additional pay-for the parks? I'm sure there are, and I'll continue to work on that. And I'll continue to look at ways to do it. But $12.5 billion, it's not going to happen without a lot of controversy. So this is about being sure we are doing what's right for our parks. It's also, though, helpful in terms of jobs, as you can imagine, because these projects are infrastructure. We talk a lot about that around here, and typically we don't even think about paying for it. We just say we're going to do an infrastructure stimulus project, as an example, as was done back in '08 and '09. In this case, these are shovel-ready and vetted projects. Again, we've required as Congress for the Park Service to give us what the projects are. So I can give you the list for your state. I've done that with my colleagues, given them the list of what the top priorities are for their state, how much money it is, what the project is, how you do it. You don't have to go and get the permits that you might have to get on non-federal land because these are on national park property. And they just keep building up higher and higher, but they're ready. They're ready to go. They're also vetted. They also don't have to go through the same process that some would if they were on non-public land. And they create a lot of jobs. We just have a report that's been approved by the Office of Management and Budget that came out of the Park Service showing that the number of jobs that are direct jobs related to this National Park Restoration Act we're talking about that we're voting on today is over 40,000 jobs. When you do direct and indirect, including suppliers to these projects, so you got the person who is fixing the bridge I talked about or the railroad tracks, but who provides the material to put the new railroad ties in, it's over 100,000 jobs. So over 100,000 jobs are created just from this legislation. So it's the right thing to do no matter what. But it also happens to be a really opportune time for us to put in place some funding that goes directly into good-paying, high-quality jobs, average pay $65,000 to $70,000 a year, to be able to help with regard to the post-coronavirus economic downturn that we've seen and will see for some time. So this is good legislation for all these reasons. There's also been an analysis done recently about what happens if you don't fix these parks and the parks aren't able to open. There is a $41 billion economic benefit for communities around the parks. That's $41 billion a year. Think about that. It supports more than 340,000 jobs. So these are not jobs in the park itself, but surrounding. So this is the restaurants and the hotels and the outfitters and so on. So our national parks are not only a great way for us to help create more jobs with regard to the infrastructure needs that are overwhelming with good stewardship, not expanding, again, 1 acre, but just taking better care of what we have. But it's also an opportunity for us to help our economy, to help ensure that we are putting people back to work in good-paying jobs, and help ensure that taxpayers aren't going to foot an even higher bill by not taking care of that leaking roof that then causes the mold on the wall, that then causes the floor to couple. We're going to get this started. Will there be need for more funding? Absolutely. And again, some of the ideas that I've talked to my colleagues about as to how to find additional funding, I'm all ears. Again, I've done it. I've raised the fees in the legislation. I have looked at the private sector, and we brought in, over $150 million of private sector money. But this $6.5 billion, which is the amount in this legislation to deal with the highest priority infrastructure projects and problems at our parks, is absolutely essential. Let's not wait any longer. Let's get this done now and ensure we can continue to enjoy not just the beauty and the history of our national parks, but also those economic benefits I talked about, and do so for generations to come. I yield back.